I never expected a single evening to change everything. It all began on a cool autumn night when a routine glance at my phone turned my world upside down. I was coming home from work, exhausted and eager for a quiet dinner with Jasmine, when a single, cryptic message appeared on my screen. A message I wasn't meant to see. The notification was from an unknown number, containing nothing more than a location pin and the time, 8:15 p.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tucked my phone away, trying to dismiss it as a mistake, but that evening, every second seemed to stretch out with an unsettling anticipation. And my wife, Jasmine, had always been the steady presence in my life. We met in college, her laugh infectious, her eyes sparkling with mischief, and built a life full of routine, small surprises, and shared dreams. Our home in suburban Ohio was the picture of domestic bliss, with weekend barbecues, quiet evenings on the porch, and a mutual trust that had always been our foundation. But that night, as I drove through darkened streets, I couldn't help but wonder if I was missing something crucial. A secret hidden behind the routine. I arrived at our neat, two-story house just before the scheduled time on the mysterious message. Jasmine was out shopping, she had told me, running errands that she said took longer than usual. In the quiet, I sat on the porch, glancing at my phone and then out into the night, feeling as if I were waiting for an inevitable storm. The clock ticked relentlessly. Then, around 8:15 p.m., my phone buzzed again. A short text message from the same number. I'm waiting. Curiosity and a nagging sense of dread compelled me to check. I pressed the map icon and saw the pin dropped on a nearby park, not far from our home. My heart thumped harder as I considered what might be happening there. I was a rational man. I told myself that it was probably nothing, maybe a wrong number, a prank. Yet the gut feeling in my chest wouldn't relent, and I took a deep breath and decided to drive to the park. It was an impulse I couldn't ignore. The road led me to a quiet area fringed with old trees and empty benches, the kind of place where one might meet someone for a discreet conversation. I parked my car and sat in the driver's seat for a few moments, debating whether I should call Jasmine. But the night was too silent, the air too heavy with uncertainty, and so I waited. Minutes passed. I scanned the darkened park with my eyes, the beam of my headlights barely reaching beyond the far end of a winding path. Then, just as I was about to call her, I saw a figure moving near one of the benches. A lone silhouette standing under the faint glow of a street lamp. The figure was unmistakably female, and I realized, with a shock that stung sharper than I expected, that it was Jasmine. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her. I couldn't make out his features clearly, but he wore a casual, unassuming jacket and his stance was too relaxed to suggest any danger to her. Jasmine's posture, however, was different. She appeared both alert and apologetic, as if caught between two worlds. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles blanched. For a long moment, I couldn't move, torn between the urge to confront her and the desire to flee. The park, with its whispering winds and rustling leaves, held its breath with me. I decided to pull out my phone and send a quick text to her. "Where are you?" "I'm at the park." Almost immediately, she replied with a terse, "Ben, please call me later." That was all she said. The answer was vague, dismissive, and it only deepened the knot in my stomach. I returned to the car, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. The image of Jasmine, standing in that dim light with another man, seared itself into my memory. And yet, as I drove home in silence, I resolved to piece together what was happening. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, or a situation that was not meant for me to witness. I replayed every moment in my head, searching for clues I might have missed. The next morning, the normalcy of day seemed surreal. I went about my routine as if nothing had happened, but the memory of that night lurked in every shadow. At breakfast, Jasmine was unusually quiet, her smile a little too forced as she recounted mundane details of her errands. I asked a few casual questions about the errands, the park, anything, but she deflected with practiced ease. I wanted to press, to demand a story, but something held me back. The shock of that night had left me numb, and I feared that an outright confrontation would shatter our carefully built life. As the days passed, I found myself obsessing over small details. The way Jasmine's eyes darted away when certain topics were mentioned, the way her phone seemed to be her constant companion. I noted these things quietly, like a detective collecting evidence. I knew that there was more beneath the surface than her ordinary explanations. But even as the suspicion grew, I made sure not to let it show. I continued to fulfill my role as the supportive husband, attending to our home, our shared responsibilities, all while silently tracking the anomalies that now marked our life. I decided to monitor her routine with a sense of detached curiosity. I would ask about her plans, the places she visited, and her responses were always short and elusive. The mystery of that night, the unexplained meeting in the park, had begun to unravel the fabric of trust that I had once believed unbreakable. And yet, in the back of my mind, I kept hoping that it was all just a misunderstanding. A misinterpreted gesture, a coincidence, nothing more. Every morning as I left for work, the memory of that fateful evening was with me, urging me to look beyond the surface. I began to compile a mental log of our interactions, paying attention to subtle shifts in tone, the hesitations, and the fleeting glances that might betray a hidden truth. I was careful not to jump to conclusions, for I had learned that truth often hides behind layers of silence and half-truths. I was determined to find out, slowly and methodically. Evenings became times of quiet reflection. I would sit in the living room after dinner, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood serving as a backdrop to my thoughts. I resisted the urge to interrogate Jasmine directly, not yet willing to shatter the fragile balance of our everyday life. Instead, I kept my suspicions tucked away, watching and waiting for a clearer sign that would confirm or dispel my doubts. That first week was a delicate dance between suspicion and denial. Jasmine continued with her daily routines, and I continued to search for meaning in the shadows. Every small detail, a misplaced text, a hurried phone call, an unexpected trip out of town, became a piece of the puzzle. I clung to the hope that, eventually, the truth would reveal itself naturally, without the need for an explosive confrontation. And so, I played my part, the unsuspecting husband who was slowly becoming a man caught in a web of secrets. The tension in our home was palpable, though Jasmine and I never spoke of it directly. I carried the burden of what I knew in silence, each day a test of restraint. I knew that soon the facade would crack, that the truth would come tumbling out. But until then, I resolved to be patient, to let the evidence accumulate. After all, the quiet before the storm can be the most revealing moment of all. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would expose every hidden corner of our life. One that would force me to confront the unexpected and irrevocable betrayal hidden behind a smile I once believed was pure. Over the next several days, I began to notice subtle shifts in our everyday routine, small details that, in isolation, might have been dismissed as coincidences but now formed a disturbing pattern. I kept a careful log in the quiet moments before bed. My days were filled with the regular demands of work and home, but every interaction with Jasmine now carried an undercurrent of unspoken tension. I refused to dive into psychological introspection or a torrent of emotions. Instead, I recorded the facts as they unfolded. One Tuesday evening, I came home earlier than usual from a late meeting. The house was quiet, and Jasmine was absent. I assumed she had gone out to run errands or meet a friend, yet the clock on the wall told me it was nearly 6:30 p.m., a time when she typically returned. The living room lamp was still on, casting long shadows across the patterned rug, and the silence was almost oppressive. I decided to wait a while, sitting by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. My phone remained silent. No messages from the mysterious number from that autumn night. The absence of communication was as unsettling as a burst of unexpected noise. Later that evening, I found Jasmine in the study, her attention focused intently on her laptop. When she noticed me, her eyes flickered with something that could have been apprehension or guilt, an expression I couldn't quite read. "I was just finishing up some work," she said curtly, not meeting my gaze. I nodded, unwilling to press further. But as I stepped out of the study, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. half expecting to see a shadow lurking behind her. The moment passed without incident, but the memory of that look lingered. That night, after Jasmine had gone to bed, I took a drive to clear my mind. The open road under the night sky was both therapeutic and a setting that seemed perfect for reflection. I passed by the park where I had seen her, and the memory of that enigmatic meeting tugged at my thoughts again. The quiet darkness and the empty bench under the flickering street lamp now appeared more ominous than ever. The unresolved questions were like ghosts, haunting every mile I traveled. In the days that followed, I observed more inconsistencies. Jasmine's phone, once casually placed on the counter, was now often hidden away. I caught glimpses of text messages on its screen, brief, cryptic exchanges that ended as soon as I looked up. She started leaving the house at odd hours, always with an excuse that felt rehearsed. I noted the discrepancies, the timestamps that didn't align with her usual schedule. Every anomaly was a clue, a fragment of evidence that added to the growing mosaic of betrayal. One Saturday afternoon, I returned home to find Jasmine out and the house felt unnervingly empty. I decided to search for clues in the more public spaces of our lives. I visited a local cafe we used to frequent together. The barista remembered her well. Jasmine would come in for a coffee and a quiet corner to read or chat on the phone. Today, however, she arrived in a hurry, her eyes darting around as if expecting to be followed. I sat at a table near the window, quietly observing. I saw her pull out her phone, type something quickly, and then glance around nervously. I couldn't be sure what I was witnessing, but the dissonance between her usual calm demeanor and this hurried behavior was stark. Later, I drove by the area near the park. I saw a car parked in a spot I hadn't noticed before, a dark sedan with tinted windows parked in the shadow of a row of trees. I couldn't tell if it was parked there intentionally or by chance, but its presence stirred up memories of that previous night. I made a mental note of the license plate, though I knew it wouldn't be of much use without further evidence. Still, it was one more piece of the puzzle. Every day, I balanced on the edge of routine and suspicion. At work, I was efficient and focused, yet my mind was always drifting back to home. I avoided direct confrontation with Jasmine, not out of ignorance but a desire to gather facts. I was meticulous in my approach, discreet observations, a careful tally of inconsistencies, and a silent determination to uncover the truth without letting emotions cloud my judgment. I was simply a man recording the events unfolding around him, a factual account of moments that, when pieced together, would reveal a story of betrayal. That evening, after a long day, I found myself in our garage organizing some old boxes. A task meant to keep my mind occupied. In one of the boxes, I found a stack of receipts and a calendar with scribbled notes. The dates on the calendar were marked with appointments that I didn't recall discussing with Jasmine. They were times when she supposedly had work meetings that she had never elaborated on. The receipts, too, were unusual: dinner bills at upscale restaurants we'd never visited together and purchases that seemed out of character for our modest lifestyle. I stored these findings away carefully, knowing that each detail was a silent testimony to something I had feared all along. I kept my voice neutral when I addressed these anomalies in conversation with Jasmine. I noticed a few extra receipts from this past month, I said casually one evening at dinner. I don't recall us dining at such places. Her fork paused midair for a split second before she replied, I just went out with a friend. It was the kind of explanation that did little to soothe the rising tension in my chest. I made no further comment, letting the silence between us grow heavy with unspoken truths. By the end of that week, the evidence had multiplied, a series of small, seemingly insignificant events that, taken together, pointed toward a hidden reality. I still refrained from labeling the situation too soon. Instead, I continued my methodical approach, confident that the truth would eventually emerge on its own. The allure of certainty was strong, and I was prepared to face it without resorting to accusations or emotional tirades. As the days blurred into one another, I could feel the weight of each passing moment. Each small detail that contributed to the larger picture of betrayal. The calm, steady life I had known was now laced with doubt and intrigue, and every interaction carried a hidden meaning. My observations were purely factual, devoid of the introspection that might have led me down a darker path. I was simply chronicling events, building a case piece by piece. Little did I know that the next turn in this winding road of secrets would force me to confront the undeniable truth, a moment when every carefully observed clue would come crashing together, leaving no room for doubt. It was a brisk Wednesday evening when the puzzle finally snapped into place. I had arranged to meet a colleague for a drink after work, a distraction from the growing unease at home. My mind, however, was not on the conversation. I was replaying in my head the incongruities of the past few weeks, the phone messages, the evasive explanations, the mysterious receipts, and the unmistakable memory of that fateful night in the park. I resolved to leave the confrontation until I was absolutely certain, yet destiny had other plans. After our drinks, I returned home earlier than usual, the chill of the evening accompanied by an even colder realization that something was terribly amiss. As I parked, I noticed a light under the living room door, a light that had not been on when I left. Instinctively, I stepped inside, each footstep measured and deliberate. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I made my way to the living room, and that's when I heard it. A soft murmur of conversation coming from the study. I approached slowly, the sound growing clearer. Peering through the slightly ajar door, I saw Jasmine seated on the couch with the same man from that night in the park. They were speaking in hushed tones, their body language relaxed and intimately familiar. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, steady conversation that confirmed every doubt I had harbored. The evidence was undeniable. Jasmine had been meeting with this man, not by accident but with purpose. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to remain still. I listened to snippets of their conversation, exchanges about upcoming plans, secret rendezvous, and inside jokes that I knew nothing about. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the life I thought I knew. I didn't need to hear every detail, the sight of them together was enough to shatter the illusion of our shared past. In that suspended moment, time seemed to slow. I backed away quietly, the shock of betrayal coursing through me without the need for emotional overtone. I collected my thoughts with a cold, clear rationality, recording every detail for what I knew would be a necessary confrontation later. I left the room silently, careful not to disturb the scene, and retreated to the solitude of my car in the driveway. Once inside, I sat motionless for several minutes, the engine idling as my mind replayed the scene over and over. I had the facts laid out in stark clarity, no elaborate psychological reasoning, just undeniable evidence. The betrayal was not wrapped in tragic drama or poetic irony, it was a simple, stark fact. Jasmine, the woman I had trusted completely, had chosen another path. I thought of every unexplained moment, every unusual behavior, and it all converged into a single, irrevocable truth, determined to gather every necessary detail before confronting her. I began making discreet notes in a small notebook I kept in the glove compartment. I recorded the time, the setting, the conversation fragments I had heard, all in precise, unemotional language. I knew that confronting her in the heat of the moment would only lead to chaos. Instead, I resolved to wait until the storm had passed, to plan my next steps carefully and with clarity. In the following days, every interaction with Jasmine became a test of my restraint and composure. I maintained the facade of normalcy during the day, all the while the memory of that evening gnawed at me with a quiet, relentless persistence. I watched her from a distance, noting the moments when she would glance at her phone with a secretive smile or when she would suddenly become distracted during conversation. Each of these actions was logged, not as a prelude to drama but as factual observations. I began to discreetly inquire about her whereabouts through indirect means, a conversation with her friend from the local cafe, a comment to one of her colleagues about her recent trips. Every response, every well-practiced deflection confirmed what I already knew. There was no dramatic confession, no explosive revelation. Instead, there was a quiet, methodical unraveling of the life I had thought was shared with a partner who understood me completely. When I finally had enough evidence, I decided it was time to confront the situation head-on. I chose a late evening when Jasmine would be alone, expecting that an in-depth conversation was inevitable. I had planned every detail, the words carefully chosen, each one stripped of unnecessary emotion as if they were simply facts laid bare on a table. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the soft glow of a single lamp casting shadows on our faces. I looked her in the eyes, my voice calm and measured as I said, "Jasmine, I know about you and him. I have seen the evidence and I can't ignore the truth any longer." There was a long, heavy pause as she searched my face, perhaps for any sign of misunderstanding. Her silence was not filled with guilt or remorse, it was merely an acknowledgement of the reality we now both faced. The conversation that followed was not an explosion of emotions, but rather a clinical dissection of facts and events. I outlined every detail, every observation that had led me to this moment. Jasmine listened, her eyes downcast, and when she finally spoke, her words were quiet and devoid of the psychological theatrics one might expect in such a scenario. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said simply. There was no plea for forgiveness, no dramatic admission, just a resignation to the outcome of her actions. That night marked a turning point. a moment when the illusion of our shared life dissolved into the stark reality of betrayal. I left the house quietly soon after our conversation, the weight of what had transpired sinking in with every step. I knew that there would be no easy answers or immediate resolutions. Instead, the coming days would require careful thought and deliberate planning on how to proceed with the life I had built and the future that now seemed uncertain. The clarity of that night, the simplicity of the betrayal, left me with a resolve to move forward on my own terms. I had gathered the evidence, confronted the facts, and now had to decide on my next steps in a life forever changed by the quiet unraveling of trust. And so, with the cold, precise logic that had carried me through these turbulent days, I prepared for the inevitable aftermath. And the days following that stark confrontation, the atmosphere in our home shifted from tense silence to a carefully constructed calm. I moved through my routine with measured precision, while Jasmine maintained an outward semblance of normalcy. Each day was a balance of factual observations and the necessary administrative details of everyday life. Bills to pay, schedules to keep, and appointments to attend. There was no dramatic fallout, no public scene. Instead, the betrayal was managed quietly, with a focus on the logistics of life rather than the emotional turmoil that often accompanies infidelity. I methodically organized my thoughts and evidence, not for a court battle or a sensational confrontation, but simply as a record of the truth. I began making practical plans for the future, steps to secure my finances, a schedule for meetings with a lawyer, and arrangements for a place where I might eventually start over if things could not be repaired. My actions were deliberate and rational, devoid of the dramatic introspection that one might expect. This was a matter of fact, not emotion. Jasmine, for her part, seemed to accept the situation with a quiet resignation. When I proposed that we take some time apart to sort out our next steps, she nodded silently. We arranged for separate nights in our home, each retreating into our own spaces with minimal conversation. In the days that followed, I observed her interactions carefully. She packed a single suitcase, meticulously placing only a few personal items inside. Every movement, every gesture, was measured and purposeful, a silent acknowledgement that the path forward was uncertain and perhaps irrevocable. I refrained from delving into the psychological underpinnings of her actions. Instead, I focused on the facts. The receipts, the messages, the timings of her absences, and the unmistakable memory of that night in the park. I documented every detail, ensuring that nothing was left unrecorded. This was not a journey into emotional healing. It was a methodical unfolding of reality, stripped of any melodrama. My days became a series of routine tasks punctuated by the quiet weight of the truth, each moment a reminder of the life I once thought secure. Late one afternoon, I received a call from her attorney, a necessary step that confirmed the gravity of our situation. The conversation was terse, factual, and entirely businesslike. The attorney outlined the next steps, from the division of assets to the logistics of our living arrangements, all without a hint of personal sentiment. I took careful notes, ensuring that every detail was recorded for future reference. This process, though painful, was approached as a series of necessary actions rather than an emotional journey. It was simply another set of facts to be managed that I spent several evenings working alone in the study, sorting through documents and making lists of tasks to complete. The methodical nature of these tasks provided a kind of solace, a structured way to regain control over a situation that had otherwise become unpredictable. The quiet clack of the keyboard and the measured scratch of pen on paper became the soundtrack to my new reality. Each completed task, each resolved detail, served as a small victory in an otherwise bleak chapter of my life. Despite the calm exterior, there were moments of silent reflection when I allowed myself to revisit the facts of our past. I remembered the early days of our relationship, the shared dreams and quiet promises that once formed the foundation of our life together. Yet, I never lingered on the emotional impact, only on the sequence of events that had led us here. I recalled the texts that now read like a series of factual markers. Appointments with the mysterious man, evenings spent in clandestine meetings, and the final, undeniable confrontation in our living room. There was no catharsis in these recollections, only a clear, unembellished recounting of the events as they had unfolded. Jasmine continued to move through her days with the same measured detachment. We exchanged necessary information, addresses, dates, and plans for our future, but our interactions remained strictly procedural. The intimacy we once shared had been replaced by a series of practical negotiations. I found myself compartmentalizing every moment, separating the emotional residue from the factual tasks at hand. This compartmentalization allowed me to proceed without the added burden of overwhelming sentiment. One evening, as I was reviewing a final list of tasks for the coming week, Jasmine unexpectedly entered the study. The room was filled with the soft glow of a desk lamp, and for a moment, we simply regarded each other with the distant familiarity of old partners who once shared everything. She spoke in a measured tone. "I've made arrangements for the sale of some shared assets. I believe it's best for both of us to move forward independently." Her words were not a plea for forgiveness nor an expression of remorse. They were a statement of fact, a logistical step in the inevitable process of untangling our lives. I acknowledged her words with a nod, replying in kind, "I've arranged for an independent evaluation of our finances. I believe it's best that we both proceed with a clear, objective perspective." There was no argument, no raised voices, only the calm, clinical negotiation of details that had once been the foundation of our partnership. Our conversation was like a contract being drafted in real time, each word weighed for its factual content rather than any hidden emotional subtext. In the weeks that followed, the practicalities of separating our lives began to take shape. I focused on building a new routine, one that was as much about regaining stability as it was about setting the stage for a future I hadn't planned. I continued my work, attended to my responsibilities, and gradually started to see the outlines of a life rebuilt from the steady accumulation of facts and actions. The betrayal, though ever present in the background, was managed as a series of tasks, something to be catalogued and moved on from. There were no grand gestures of reconciliation or dramatic confrontations in those days. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, a recognition that the past was a collection of undeniable facts and that the future, though uncertain, could be approached with the same methodical clarity. The home we once shared became a repository of memories and evidence, and the space between us filled with a silence that was as measured as the ticking of a clock. By the time I began to truly plan for a life beyond the confines of our shared past, I had reached a place of quiet resolution. The betrayal was not a storm to be weathered with explosive emotion, but a series of facts to be managed, one by one. And as I closed the notebook on that turbulent chapter, I prepared for the final step in a process that had been as much about reclaiming control as it had been about acknowledging a painful truth. In the final weeks of our shared life, I focused on finalizing the practical details of our separation. The evidence I had gathered had led to a quiet confrontation and a decision to part ways without dramatic farewells. Every action was measured, a careful division of assets, methodical updates to legal documents, and the silent acknowledgement that our lives were now on separate paths. I spent mornings reviewing financial records and afternoons sorting through paperwork. Each task was performed with precision, stripping away the remnants of what had once been a shared future. The process was clinical, a series of steps to ensure that every detail was managed and every account was closed. There was no space for sentimentality, only a series of facts that needed to be resolved. One brisk morning, I received a brief email from Jasmine confirming that all final documents had been forwarded to our attorneys. The message was devoid of emotion. "Ben, everything is in order. I wish you well." I read it twice, each word another data point confirming that our partnership had ended. I responded in kind, ensuring that our communications remained strictly professional. Our once familiar home had transformed into a space of orderly detachment. I watched as Jasmine packed a single suitcase and made arrangements to move out. We exchanged only the necessary information: addresses, dates for meetings with lawyers, and details for the sale of shared property. There was no confrontation, only the silent acceptance that this chapter was closing. During one of my routine visits to the bank to finalize the sale of our home, I paused to reflect on the orderly progression of events. In the reflection of the car window, I saw a man who had transformed his pain into a series of deliberate, rational decisions. Every transaction, every signature was a step towards reclaiming a life that was solely my own. I left the bank with a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that, despite the betrayal, I had maintained control over my destiny. Later that week, I signed a lease for a modest apartment in a new part of town. The place was empty, its walls waiting to be filled with a new routine. I arranged for utilities, updated my address with all relevant institutions, and began planning a fresh start. The weight of the past was recast as a series of verifiable facts and necessary actions, a ledger of events that had finally led to closure. I end this new chapter. Every decision was made with clarity and purpose. I reconnected with old friends, returned to professional projects, and embraced a life defined by the steady accumulation of daily tasks. The betrayal was no longer a storm to be weathered, it was a collection of facts that had reshaped my life. As I settled into my new apartment, I looked ahead with a sense of quiet determination, ready to build a future founded on the same methodical approach that had seen me through the unraveling of trust. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.